Further ado, I would say I will hand over to Dr. Brunache. Welcome. And if you could briefly, introduce yourself and then start your presentation, that would be lovely.
Thank you so much, Kim. And thank you to everyone at Cambridge University for inviting me to speak. I am a lecturer at the University of Glasgow in Atlantic slavery. I'm also the director of the newly established Beniba Center for Slavery Studies, which is the first institution of its kind in Scotland. Obviously, I'm a historical archaeologist, but I'm actually in the history department and I dabble in the archaeology department. And whenever I get a chance, I'm in the Caribbean, I'm dealing with colleagues and partnerships in the US too. So I'm kind of all over the place. But to make it simple, historical archaeologist in the history department at Glasgow. So I guess we'll just get into it because I don't want to cut into people's happy hour too long. So let me share my screen. All right. As a scholar of historical archaeology with an emphasis on the Americas, my work straddles between several disciplines. And since the late 1980s, historical archaeology in the Caribbean has endeavored to provide a unique contribution to Black diasporic studies by moving beyond the focus of primary and secondary documents to include the study of material culture and landscape that may further our understanding of African nations during the Atlantic slave trade, as well as the past life waves of the Black Atlantic. Although scholars have focused on enslaved Africans and their descendants under British, Dutch, and Spanish colonial powers, similar studies in the French Caribbean, although still in its infancy, presents intriguing avenues to reveal and possibly reactivate voices of Black subjects under French rule. These Black subjects, were the colonial majority, but most were rendered silent or passive in the historiography of slavery. My presentation today briefly explores Black foodways as a form of daily subsistence practices that during slavery and as well as after slavery, it was a form of transformative Black resistance for identity formation and societal change. Firstly, since we're in Britain, I'll set the context of my research based on slave foodways in the French Caribbean, then discuss excavations at the sugar plantation known as Habitation La Mordière in Guadeloupe and my zoological results to understand Black foodways of the pre and post-emancipation era. Ultimately, I frame my work in a Black feminist critique of French Antillean identity theory as a form of culinary resistance and identity formation. Until recently, the study of slave foodways has relied on primary sources and other forms of textual evidence and concluded that throughout the colonial period in the French Caribbean, slave nourishment was a constant source of confusion and criticism. There is a general consensus that slave food and general diet in the Caribbean during the colonial era was problematic. However, I would go further and say that nourishment for the enslaved laborers in the French colonies was an arena of multiple conflicts and had been so from the beginning of intense colonization. According to primary sources, since the onset of colonization, slaveholders tried to enforce a high caloric diet that included tubers and other complex carbohydrates like manioc, yams, sweet potatoes, guinea corn, and rice, with little nutritional value for the enslaved laborers. More resourceful individuals kept gardens next to their homes to grow herbs and fruits and vegetables and whatnot. Now, to be clear, food for the enslaved Africans was insufficient for several reasons. Threats of famine were constant throughout the ancient regime. Environmental factors negatively affected the food production to supply the enslaved population. Many of the islands were subject to hurricanes and fires, which often created food shortages. And then you also had the prolonged droughts and some overly wet seasons that also tampered with the ability to grow foodstuffs locally. Delivery of certain provisions, such as salted fish or meat and grain by cargo ships, were often irregular and unpredictable. Therefore, if naval imports could safely arrive, and if the planter allowed it, the enslaved laborers would occasionally receive servings of salted fish or beef to supplement their starchy diet. Now, I stress the word if for the worst reason of all, the basic neglect on the part of the plantation owners. On the one hand, there was a battle between the French administration and slaveholders. The crisis in food provision for the enslaved began as a result of intense French cultivation of sugarcane around 1670. The growing dependence upon an enslaved African labor force assisted in the formation of more racially constructed culinary practices under a well-defined institution of slavery and stratified social settings. The French government interceded by establishing the Code Noir in the last decades of the 17th century, requiring planters to supplement the slave provisions with little effect. Colonial administrations responded by passing local ordinances for provision grounds that were to specifically be used for cultivating yams, sweet potatoes, and other tubers. However, those ordinances were never actively enforced, leaving many witnesses perplexed by how the enslaved community would survive. In their chronicles, travelers went so far as to say that the slavers exhibited a destructive, quote, stinginess, unquote, and that it left the enslaved community constantly undernourished. Planters chose to concentrate on planting sugarcane for export and neglecting suitable space on their lands for foodstuffs to feed their enslaved laborers. Thus, food was a struggle between planters and the enslaved laborers, and slave nourishment remained a major dilemma throughout the 18th and well into the 19th century until emancipation. Now, while it's certain that foodways of the French Caribbean went through various changes throughout the colonial era, its nuances may not have been observed by European travelers. Rather, we have a generalized understanding of food practices for enslaved Africans. French colonists, travelers, and visiting officials viewed slave food not only as inadequate, but also monotonous. Since the mid to late 17th century, French colonists and the colonial government officials made note of slave meals, often characterized by one-pot stews. By the 18th century, some of these one-pot stews were called Creole ragouts and were described as being a, quote, strange hodgepodge, unquote, of meat or salted fish that was heavily seasoned with hot peppers. However, one cannot overstate how European observers and the French planter class viewed slave food as markedly different and substandard from their own, stressing that the core of the slave diet was minimal, stodgy, with little animal protein. This racialized appraisal of culinary value placed onto the slave diet was yet another marker that fixed the enslaved community's subordinate and marginalized status within the colonial hierarchy. Furthermore, the French identified the enslaved community as passive victims when compared with the diverse culinary tastes of the planter class and their accessibility to foodstuffs of high quality. So whether because of external forces or internal conditions, insufficient food provisions were continuously problematic, and enslaved communities had to strategize to not only survive and sustain life under an institution of racialized terror, but to also provide nutritional and culinary satisfaction to their meals. To help broaden my understanding of slave foodways, I looked to other lines of evidence, including archaeological investigations at La Mordière. Existing scholarship on the foodways of enslaved Africans in the French Caribbean has predominantly focused on the examination of primary and secondary literature, with at least one exception, that of Tamara Varney's 2003 study of stable isotopes of bone and dental tissues from skeletons from the Sainte Marguerite cemetery site on Guadeloupe to reconstruct the slave diet. In terms of slave alimentation, there were two methods, either supplied by the planter or by the enslaved themselves. Analysis of primary historical sources suggests that unreliable and unstable distributions of food rations forced the enslaved laborers to actively participate and ultimately control subsistence practices for survival, particularly through the use and management of kitchen gardens located just outside the domestic slave dwellings, that is to grow fruit trees and herbs and some leafy vegetables, as well as the maintenance of large cultivation plots or slave provision grounds as crucial components to supplement the slave rations. Moreover, these subsistence practices became the cornerstone of the slave economy. More recent historical studies have aggrandized to critically engage larger questions as to how slave diet and subsistence practices may have played a central role in the lives of Black laborers during and after slavery, and for the greater island society and economy. While we have discovered some of the aspects of slave diet and the complexity of slave foodways, these studies have not often sought to uncover a direct connection to identity formation of enslaved populations and their descendants. For my work, I studied faunal remains recovered from the slave village at Habitation La Mordière for some zoological data to couple with primary sources in the secondary literature in an effort to provide an alternative narrative of slave diet than the often misinformed public memory of a homogeneous and stodgy diet made up of the plantation owner's scraps with little appetizing pleasure. Instead, I stress Black foodways was a form of culinary resistance to this arena of multiple conflicts for alimentation, but also as a consideration for identity formation processes under this institution of terror. With permission from the principal investigator, Ken Kelly, at the University of South Carolina at Columbia, I assisted in several field seasons at Habitation La Mordière and Grande Terre on the archipelagos of Guadeloupe, as it provided a unique opportunity for an archaeological and historical study of slavery and post-emancipation era in the French Caribbean. The plantation, or habitation as it's called in French, is located in the northeast commune of Anse-Bertrand, near the hamlet of Campeche, and is owned by the Conseil Régional of Guadeloupe, which is the local regional government. And just to give you some idea of what that landscape looks like now, there's this picture with the defunct windmill. And you can see here how it's not that far away from the coastline, which will be important to discuss in a few minutes. Here's a better understanding of how there are still plenty of sugarcane farms are still operating right outside of Campeche. And even the defunct windmill has now been converted to a chapel. Now, the original estate proprietor was Etienne Douillard Maraudière, and the property began as a cotton farm as early as 1732 and would remain in the family until the late 18th century. Over the next decades, the property evolved into a prosperous sugar plantation of 465 hectares, a relatively large-scale plantation fluctuating between 100 to 200 enslaved laborers, with an on-site sugar works to process the sugarcane under the ownership of the slaveholder Jean-Baptiste Douillard Mordière. It is by sheer coincidence that we came to study the site associated with one of colonial France's most infamous court cases of inhumane torture. In October of 1841, Jean-Baptiste was charged with excessive abuses against a biracial enslaved seamstress named Lucille on suspicion of poisoning estate livestock and the alleged poisoning and murder of Jean-Baptiste's wife. The 40-year-old enslaved woman was kept chained in an air-deprived, dark and cramped cachot, which is a dungeon, with insufficient food and water for 22 months. The court heard testimony in this case for 3 days, and eventually, surprise, surprise, Jean-Baptiste was acquitted of the charges. And just so you understand, vestiges of these structures for racialized torture still exist. They're peppered all over Guadeloupe that you could visit if you wanted to go out there. Even after emancipation in 1848, the plantation continued to cultivate and process sugarcane until it fell out of the hands of the original family around 1881. Due to the limited historical information we could recover, we had been unsuccessful in locating many journals or estate management records, so our excavations were guided by survey results. In some areas, surface evidence of foundational structures were easily recognizable and allowed us to identify the slave village in relation to the sucrerie, which is the sugar works, and the remains of the planter's house. Test unit depths rarely surpass 50 centimeters before hitting the natural limestone bedrock unless we encountered post holes, much of which were related to structures that were made of wattle and daub style. So those houses, those early slave dwellings were called cases galette. By 1802, the houses were rebuilt in masonry to be larger and more uniform and arranged in regular rows. And after slavery ended in 1848, Black plantation laborers continued to live and work as sharecroppers with the addition of some South Asian indentured laborers. Over several seasons of excavation, we recovered a bevy of locally produced and imported material culture associated with different activities, including foodways. Besides French imported and locally manufactured coarse earthenware, French refined ceramics such as faience blanche and faience brune in the style of refined British wares like creamware and pearlware suggest the earliest site occupation was in the second half of the 18th century. The artifact assemblage is rich enough to consider a variety of theories and functional analyses to provide insight into intra-site variability and the daily practices of consumer choice amongst pre- and post-emancipatory laborers. But for the purpose of this talk, I'll shift to the zooarchaeology and its relationship to the Black laborers of the plantation. Now, please forgive me for this horribly small written table. If there is anyone out there who knows how to make a table look sexy and readable, please contact me after this is all done. The faunal assemblage represents about 30 taxa of wild and domestic species and suggests that plantation laborers during slavery and afterwards relied on a variety of marine and terrestrial sources for animal protein. During slavery, terrestrial protein is represented by some beef, but the higher biomass, that is the edible meat, that percentage is for pork. And as for culinary practices and cooking methods, butchery marks and other forms of bone modification revealed that the majority of the highly fragmented animal bones recovered in the slavery context, as well as the post-emancipation era, are most likely indicative of stewed meals. The majority of ceramics from the artifact assemblage recovered included numerous bowl sherds and pot sherds for cooking on open fires, which supports the notion of soup and stewed-based meals. The popularity of one-pot meals, such as kalaloo, cooked by Black women, was evident as early as the late 18th century by French witnesses, and it remains a culinary tradition today. But it was the result of marine sources that I found most interesting. The biomass percentage for marine invertebrates, such as West Indian topshell, clams, chitin, conch, etc., provided an abundant source of meat, contributing just over 50% of the total edible meat for the faunal assemblage of the 18th to early 19th century slavery period. Mollusks and bivalves and other species of shellfish collected along intertidal zones during low tides, and occasionally some fish, provided a significant contribution of edible meat protein to the slave diet. The significant presence of shellfish taxa in the laborers' consumption patterns served as a response and supplement to the insufficient amounts of beef and pork in their diets. A strategy also identified through archaeological analyses of at least one Martinican plantation. Oh, I think I went too far. If they did not have access to enough beef and pork, then Black laborers consciously and aggressively sought out marine-based meat. West Indian topshell, or whelks, which are also known as bougot in the French Caribbean, is the most common shellfish recovered in the assemblage. The species is a culturally and ecologically important intertidal gastropod in the Caribbean and inhabits rocky shores and intertidal zones. The relative ease of collection made the whelk a common subsistence choice by indigenous people of the Caribbean, as well as the enslaved communities with access to the shoreline during the colonial era. According to 18th and 19th century primary sources, it was considered everyday food, but more importantly, inferior food for the inhabitants who weren't well nourished. With regards to La Mordière, this isn't surprising considering the plantation lies about 2.2 kilometers or 1.37 miles to the west of the island's coastline. The shore is a rough landscape without significant beach land, but it does have enough rocky intertidal zones to collect various shellfish during low tide. Thus, the enslaved community took full advantage to gather as much shellfish to not only supplement their nutritional needs, but also to diversify the tastes and textures of their meals, an opportunity not available on other plantations too far away from the coastline or major waterways. Unlike fishing that requires sufficient time and skill, collecting whelks and similar shellfish would have been an activity easily performed by children and adults during the relative period of downtime away from field work or sugar production. The zoological study of a similar sugar plantation, Habitation Quercur, on Martinique by Diane Wallman of the University of South Florida suggests the enslaved laborers heavily exploited whelks there as well, whereas the sample from the planters complex was comprised largely of oysters and some clam. Furthermore, zoological studies on several British Caribbean plantation sites reveal a similar heavy reliance on whelks, suggesting that the exploitation of this univalve mollusk is an understudied consumption choice of enslaved communities for historical archaeology of the Caribbean. It was surprising that conch, which has the highest meat yield for shellfish, did not demonstrate a strong representation in this sample. They are typically found in shallow waters with grassy or sandy substrates. Several reasons for their underrepresentation may include the immediate coastline just does not appear to present easy or safe access for conch harvesting, or the species was processed at procurement sites elsewhere and discarded. There it is also. If the shells were brought back to the slave village, it's also possible that the residents did not dispose of the shells as readily as they did with other gastropods found throughout the sheet-like midden in the slave village area. Now, after 1848, Blacks continued to live at the slave village on the plantation as sharecropping laborers with the introduction of some South Asian workers. As it was during slavery, variability was evident in local and household economies of the post-emancipation era. Domestic mammals continued to provide the majority of dietary protein, while other terrestrial domestic animals appeared in the faunal assemblage. For example, chicken seems to have entered the diet and far more fish. And along with the addition of chicken, demonstrating a change in the diversity of terrestrial meats, it appears that domesticated mammals were consumed far more frequently. While edible terrestrial meat was equal to that of marine invertebrates during the slavery period, post-emancipation samples demonstrate a greater dependence on domestic mammals as meat consumption rose from 48% to around 56.7%. Post-emancipation era laborers continued to depend mostly on pork, but beef consumption did rise slightly. Given the continued exploitation of marine resources, I'm reticent to conclude that domestic animals were preferred over marine species. Rather, I would suggest that mid-19th century and early 20th century site inhabitants likely had more and better opportunities for acquiring and consuming beef and pork. While the assemblage shows that terrestrial animals were more varied, the same is also said of marine resources. Collecting shellfish continued to be a favored subsistence practice, most likely because of its ease, abundance, and accessibility. Because slave foodways operated within an arena of multiple conflicts, it allows for intriguing opportunities to uncover or theorize subtle and symbolic forms of slave resistance that differs from traditional studies. In general, slave resistance is commonly conceived as a physical and often violent reaction to racialized exploitation and terrorism and the constraints of chattel slavery. But I question this limiting definition of resistance that is either aggressive protest and rebellion or that of even marronage, which is the act of fugitivism or running away. And often it's all too conceived as a male-centered activity, even though we know that women participated in both kinds of overt resistance. But more importantly, these acts that happened infrequently, that is relative to the acts that were performed every single day, is what my focus relies on. Culinary resistance is intriguing as a concept because foodways may act as a metaphor for culture and a marker of identity denoting gender, class, status, and ethnicity, and other socio-categorical differences. As a cultural practice, it occurs every day, several times a day, in fact. And more importantly, it is replete with symbols and meanings associated with social power. Thus, slave foodways operated within this arena of multiple conflicts as a point of subtle and passive resistance, but has direct connection to identity formation of enslaved populations and their descendants. We know that the link between foodways and identity has been observed and theorized by social scientists for decades. Additionally, scholars argue further that a sense of identity and a connection to one's culture is shaped and reshaped through ordinary everyday activities. And these actions are in turn influenced by culture and identity formation processes, which is a long way of saying you are what you eat, but also what you eat says a lot about who you are. In thinking about the French Caribbean and the relationship between slave foodways and identity, My theoretical framework incorporates multiple perspectives, including post-colonial French Antillean theories of identity and cultural formation, as a step in the process of retracing how people of the past may have constructed and articulated their own identity. As my work is based in Guadeloupe, my theoretical framework is influenced by French Caribbean culture theorists, from negritude to Antillante to Creolite, as they contributed much to the development of historical and contemporary French Antillean subjectivity by rejecting French political and cultural hegemony for a truer, hybridized Antillean identity reflecting racial, historical, cultural, and geographical composites. Now, while I work through post-colonial French Antillean theories of identity and cultural formation, I found that Black women were often absent as prominent actors in this formation of French Antillean identity. Needless to say, I wasn't the first to notice this. Caribbean feminists pointed out that productions of French Caribbean identity are typically androcentric. Since the 1930s, there has been a repeated failure to acknowledge nuanced identities along the lines of gender, class, and sexuality, and not just race, in all three movements. This was particularly problematic as I was theorizing a process of retracing how people of the past may have articulated their identity through everyday practices such as cooking and other food preparation methods, with many roles historically occupied by women, and still are. And yet they were marginalized by contemporary French Antillean theorists. My theorizing of an emerging Antillean or Creole identity during slavery is heavily influenced by a Black feminist approach of oppressions with greater gender inclusivity to explore difference and self-making by validating women's experiences. Although much of the conditions of plantation life were shared by men and women alike, I do not conflate Black women's experiences of slavery with that of Black men, as their experiences of oppression and exploitation and discipline and punishment did differ. Instead, I seek to transform problematic androcentric perspectives of traditional Antillean theory and politics for an intersectional analysis to explore this difference in self-making. Therefore, I situate Black women's roles in slave subsistence practices at the center of the production of Antillean identity to relay an alternative narrative and link between slave foodways, resistance, and identity formation in these French Antillean communities. Colonial racialized interpolations of food of enslaved people mirrored the enslaved's position in societal hierarchy. For example, slave food may have held a pejorative place in the Europeans' ideology of food, but it was part of a dynamic and creolizing process of identity formation, and therefore was not necessarily reflective of the enslaved's self-identity. Moreover, a Black feminist approach helped me to identify potential examples of how women's agency, resistance, and Creole identity formation were negotiated within the context of slavery. Through an intersectional interrogation of the racial dynamics or dimensions of patriarchy, I underscore that enslaved women were relegated to the most subordinate position within the colonial society. Yet, enslaved women created a cuisine born out of slave foodways, a complex culinary form of everyday resistance that went beyond the struggle for general sustenance under an institution of racialized terror and nutritional neglect, to provide culinary satisfaction in their meals and form the basis of a new Creole identity. Their central role in the production and management of foodways for enslaved people and their descendants became a material representation of African agency and Black resistance, central to the development of collective and individual identities, but also central to domestic island economies as they were major participants in local markets. Enslaved women exercised their daily culinary skills and ingenuity to create a vernacular aesthetic, a distinct new foodway system which integrated West African, European, and New World foodstuffs and culinary techniques into what is known contemporarily as Creole cuisine in the Caribbean. In general, the historiography of slavery of the French Antilles has been weaker than other areas, especially when compared to the British. And since the late 1980s, historical archaeology has recently risen to this challenge to provide a unique contribution to further our understanding of past Black lifeways of the region. Although still in its infancy, archaeological subsistence studies focus on the colonial era of the French Caribbean utilizes a variety of skills and sources that includes historical data, isotopic study, zooarchaeology, and other archaeological methods to learn more about food procurement, processing, preparation, distribution, consumption, and discard systems of enslaved communities. However, as is sometimes seen in anthropological studies, the ontological considerations of Creole societies can be disjointed. When considering the French Caribbean's colonial past and its relationship with food, I have two intertwining goals. One, to reconstruct aspects of slave foodways of the French Caribbean, and also to contribute to a baseline of data from which to compare future assemblages. My analysis may act as the basis of an alternative understanding of slave foodways that may advance the historic faunal studies of French plantation settings that, as of yet, are not as widely studied as are the British and Spanish contexts. This alternative narrative is linked to my second goal, which is to center the role of enslaved women as actors of culinary resistance and French Creole identity formation. Engaging different archaeological and historical lines of evidence through a Black feminist lens allows me to consider a more inclusive perspective that acknowledges the participation and contribution of enslaved women in identity formation processes, that cuts across masculinist perspectives of traditional Caribbean identity theory and politics. Enslaved women's culinary creativity, which should be seen as a form of knowledge production. These were cultural activities that might have provided pride and pleasure in the act of making as often as it was in the act of eating, that helped to create and shape and bond and identify families and communities simultaneously. Furthermore, these activities performed by women must also be viewed as an identity affirming practice that was at the core of Creole culture and identity. Black women who, by race, gender, and their status as enslaved, were seemingly powerless and relegated to the lowest ranks of colonial social hierarchy. Yet, these women played a significant role as culture bearers within this culinary system that acted as a strategy to subvert and resist the politics of power while playing a role in the self-construction of their own identity, a Caribbean Creole identity that is still linked to slave foodways and Creole cuisine today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Brunache, for the fantastic talk. Please send me your questions. You can send it into chat, but I have a question to you, Dr. Brunache. What is the role of fats and oils are in the cuisine of the enslaved people? Where and still, what is the role of the fats and oils in the Creole kitchen? Sorry?
The fats and oils?
Yes.
It was absolutely essential. I wouldn't say in the manner that we're used to seeing in terms of fried food now, but oils in terms of frying was definitely evident and far more popular as part of street foods. Little akra. So there's a fried dough. In the States, you call them hush puppies. In other parts of the Caribbean, there's this kind of fried dough. And it's named after a city in Ghana, Accra. And often it'll have shellfish or a bit of codfish in it. So there's those kinds of dishes that include oil. In terms of fat was very much necessary, and would come from the little bits of salted meat that help to add flavor. So salted pork, as in pork tails or pigtails, things like that, would help to change the tiny bit of the texture, but actually add more flavor. So yes, oils were there, more so in terms of street food, but fat definitely in the stews as part of salted meats.
Thank you very much. Cliff Scott, please, you can ask your question. Unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, Peggy. Question number one is about cassava.
Hi, Cleve.
It's intriguing that you mentioned cassava being consumed by the enslaved in the French Antilles compared to flour, which is contain gluten. And there's this deep debate about diabetes and the impact of gluten. I think that you have struck goal on this cassava issue, and you should examine it more. So I would like you to compare or comment on flour in the French Antilles. That's the first question. The second question is about small bones. You mentioned stews, but I didn't hear you mention sauce. Did you consider sauce as an important element in French Antilles enslaved diets? I'm speaking from the context of the British Caribbean, where we know sauce was widely consumed. That's number two. And the final one is about intestines. Intestines, what we call tripe.
Yep.
Could you comment on tripe if you're able to? Tripe, and the final would be what we call in the English-speaking Caribbean wild meat. You didn't mention things like agouti, armadillo, iguana. If you could comment on the consumption of what we'll call wild meat. I hope that is not too much, but those are my questions. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Cleve. Okay, so cassava flour. Cassava flour is still, those of us who know the Caribbean definitely know cassava flour is still widely produced and distributed and consumed. In terms of it being associated with diabetes, I've never heard of that. More importantly, diabetes as a problem today is far more conflated with the lack of exercise and the overconsumption of sugars without getting rid of that in terms of exercise or work. Cassava flour is still considered quite healthy today. I've not heard anyone say that there's a problem with it. I'm not a fan of it. I never have been. My mother loved it and would eat all kinds of bread with it, but cassava flour has always been necessary and important in being able to consume a kind of carbohydrate, but one that's very flexible in how you make it, whether it's crackers, in terms or biscuits or bread, still very important. Tripe. So one thing I could not talk about was the consumption of offal, inner meats like tripe, lung, things like that. We don't have an archaeological record for that. We know historically that people ate it, but there would be no remnants of that. And my work was looking specifically at faunal remains, but very much so. Innards, tripe, all of these would be included in soups and stews whenever possible. What I have seen is that there was always a presence for muscle meat whenever possible. So meats that would come off the legs, the forelimbs and things like that. But Absolutely, Cleve, you're right. The consumption of offal was always present, as one would see in many peasant cultures around the world, still quite important. But I was focusing on what faunal remains that I could actually study, which were things that would come off the bone or that were in shells. Let's see, wild meats, agouti and whatnot. We did not find, at least in the samples that we were able to excavate and that I analyzed, we did not find any wild meats, though we know historically that if possible, they were hunted and consumed. So I didn't focus on that in this presentation because I did not recover or analyze anything along those lines. But yes, if it were possible, and especially during night hunting, when some enslaved laborers had the opportunity, they would obviously go and hunt agouti and other wild animals, wild mammals, if possible. But I think I missed out on one other question that you wanted me to address. Do you remember what it was? I didn't get a chance to write it down. Cleve.
Cleve, would you like to repeat your question? Can you please do it?
Oh, South. So again, okay, I see. Thank you so much. Again, an important type of animal protein that I would not be able to recover archaeologically. But of course, this does not make it any less relevant in their consumption choices. I can only discuss what I actually found and excavated and analyzed. But yes, souse was also there. They call it something else though. I can't remember what they call it. I don't care for it. Do you? I don't like it. No.
Can you define souse for us, please?
I can't. That's something I just think.
Oh yeah. Souse. I'm actually in Barbados, and every Saturday is called Souse Saturday. Souse is made from the pig's ear, the pieces of pigs. You can also do it from the cattle foot, any scrap of pig or the cattle. Yep. So what you do, you boil it and you add to it cucumbers, any leafy element like celery and so on. So it's boiled pieces of meat mixed with leafy vegetables with lime juice, and it's popular all over across the Caribbean, especially on Saturdays.
Yeah, consumer choices.
Just to say, you can read the narrative of Ashton Warner. Narrative of Ashton Warner is available online. He describes it in his slave narrative, Ashton Warner.
Of St. Vincent.
Yes, well, Ashton Warner was on St. Vincent.
Yeah.
But it was popular all across the Caribbean.
Renan Lemas, can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, do you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Peggy. Thanks so much for this very interesting talk. I wanted to ask you two related questions. The first is that coming from Brazil, we know that in Portuguese America, slave food was also seen as inferior, but feeding the enslaved groups could also work as a distinction strategy amongst colonial elites. So you would find some of the ingredients in the so-called great house in the slave quarters in the plantations. So could you develop a bit more on the topic of the continuations between a colonial diet as a whole and slave diet more specific in the Caribbean? And the second related question, especially in the period of post-emancipation, where I assume there would be more room to negotiate positions and identities. Do you see Black communities participating in such negotiations through foodways and other cultural practices and cultural entanglement more extensively? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so for your first question, this is quite interesting. There is a distinction between the foodways of the planter class in the French Caribbean and their need to make sure that it stays as French as possible, as opposed to what you see in the American South. And I suspect maybe in other places. The French were unique in that they prioritized food to such a high degree that it was, you rarely had women cooks in French colonial homes in the Caribbean, because that is a status of chefs. And so there was very little influence of French planters adopting what would become Creole cuisine later on. You don't see that so much in the French Caribbean. And the few excavations that we've been able to do, whether it's in Guadeloupe or with my colleagues in Martinique, even the particular the foodstuffs are different. So the planter family would have access to oysters, but they would never touch the West Indian whelks. That's what those people would eat. That's what the enslaved laborers eat. So they wouldn't even eat some of the same actual foodstuffs. In the US, it was quite different. Interestingly enough, the influence of enslaved laborers there did very much go into the majestic homes of slavers in the American South. And that tradition has continued so much so that most Southerners try to make white Southerners will often try to make a distinction between soul food and Southern cuisine. But there are more links to West African traditions and what was consumed and practiced during slavery than what came out of Britain. But interestingly enough, there are plenty of people who, I don't want to say appropriate, but definitely identify with Southern cuisine as something that's inherent to them without seeing a connection with slavery. In the Caribbean, particularly with the French, the distinctions were very different. But I'd be curious to hear what happened with plantations in Brazil, and if you did have that downward, upward movement of food tastes and styles leaving the slave villages and making their way into the planters' homes. That I don't know yet. Your other question about Black foodways being extensive, I don't think I got all of that. Do you mean in contemporary terms, in how?
Yeah, in contemporary terms, but like since the emancipation, like would Black communities be more able to negotiate their identities and positions through foodways and culture more extensively?
They did that during slavery, they did it after slavery. What's interesting is that a significant portion of the local economy was sustained by women and their production and distribution of food. Much of the time, it was Black women who were running local markets, enslaved women, as well as free Black women who were running local markets that were supplying foods to not just other enslaved people when possible, but also to the planter class, because you did have these situations where naval imports weren't always coming through as regularly, whether because of piracy or bad storms. Most of the the good land on these small islands were not used to grow foodstuffs that even the planter and the families would need. But very clever, savvy women were always managing not only to sustain the local economy, but actually feed the entire island through their participation in food works. Even after slavery, that continued, very much so. That continued. When you go to Guadeloupe and Martinique, and I've seen this in other islands too, many of the markets, the local markets, are still organized and run by Black women. So that tradition continues on even now. So you still see this legacy happening of Black women in control of production, or at least in significant participation, contributing to the local economy that way.
Amazing, thank you very much.
Ben Longhurst, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Peggy. I was wondering what kind of freedom, and I know that's an ironic word to use, but what kind of freedom were the slave laborers given to travel to the coastline in order to gather their marine food types?
I wouldn't say they were given freedom. They took it.
That's what I was getting at. So they weren't allowed to do it, but chose to.
Aggressively so. And because this plantation was lucky enough to be only, less than a mile and a half away, even if the vast majority of the adult laborers were working in the fields, those who weren't well enough to work but could still walk, those who were too young to be working in the fields could walk and get to the shore. That's why it was such an easy, almost no-brainer choice to make. You don't need the skills to go and literally collect shellfish that is on the shore. And it would take you very little time to get, that less than a mile and a half with your bucket, get as much as you can and get back to the plantation before someone thinks you're missing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Doug Momberg, would you like to ask a question? Okay, let me then, do you know about nutritional related diseases that may have affected enslaved people?
Yes, there were constant reports by colonial physicians talking about nutritional deficiencies. One of them caused enslaved Africans to eat soil. I think we call it pica now. It's pica. So if you're missing enough iron, there's this craving to eat things that we consider that rocks or soil or coffee grounds. That was very unfortunate. And in fact, planters either chose to not believe that this was a nutritional deficiency that was making them do things like eat dirt, eat clay. They would be punished for it. They would have particular iron masks to keep them from trying to eat this soil, but not realizing that they're not feeding the enslaved community enough. It's a very weird thing for even me to wrap my head around, that there was never a question that you would feed your beasts of burden, but yet you don't feed human beings and expect them to toil 14 hours a day under a brutal whip and expect them to survive on predominantly carbohydrates with very little other nutritional vitamins and essential amino acids and everything else that a body needs. So I can tell you definitely that was one of the unfortunate manifestations of deficiency. There were others. Obviously, many children didn't survive long enough to make it into adulthood. Babies, if they weren't given enough breast milk, couldn't get the nutrition that they needed to grow. And that was often a case of women being forced to work immediately back in the field and not being allowed to take the time to breastfeed children. I mean, there were so many conditions that unfortunately hampered the ability to be healthy. And we're not even talking about the tropical diseases and issues associated with that, or the physical violence that was placed upon them all day. But there was often never this connection of enslaved. I don't know if it wasn't a connection or just a choice to ignore that they did not need a proper diet to function in the best way possible.
Pauline.
Thank you, Peggy. I mean, just following on from your comments there, I'd be particularly interested to know what the geographical origin on the African continent was for first generation enslaved Africans being brought to the island. Partly because I'm quite intrigued by the possibility of there being sort of transfers of knowledge. You know, I wonder whether just in terms of the shellfish collecting practices, whether there's a possibility that enslaved individuals were being brought who'd grown up and had a knowledge of the Casamance, for example, in Senegal. And you mentioned eating soil, and I fully understand that these were individuals facing enormous levels of nutritional stress, and I don't want to diminish anything that you've said. But the practice of geophagy, as it's sometimes referred to, has been documented in a number of parts of the African continent. I'm more familiar with the East African example, Lua in particular, who I don't think were being entered into either the British or the Indian Ocean or the Atlantic World slave networks. But as I am aware that geophagy has been recorded in other parts of the African continent, and there, that soil eating, whilst yes, it's linked at times to nutritional stress, there are also cultural values attached to it. So that's prompting my question, where were the first generation of enslaved were coming from, and are some of these practices that you're seeing continuities, if you like, and transfers of knowledge?
Thank you, Paul. In terms of where they were coming from, obviously, I think most people are okay, at least in this audience, do know that they're coming from various parts of West and Central Africa, the Gold Coast, what's called the Slave Coast region, less so from Senegambia, further up the coastline that way. What I do think is interesting is your idea that perhaps those being brought over as captives from West Africa may have brought with them some of these traditions of collecting shells and things like that. Many of the Africans being brought over weren't normally from the coast. They were coming in from the interior and then being taken to the coast and then unfortunately forced across the ocean during the Middle Passage. Many of them have never seen an ocean, therefore the kind of shells, if even along their major waterways, would not resemble the kind of oceanic marine shellfish or mollusks that one would see or encounter when they're in Guadeloupe and other islands like that. I would not even consider it I would say it just made sense that whether it's along a interior waterway and that there are river clams or things like that, or along a marine coastline, if you can get access to that coastline, you are going to use that food and cook with it. So I wouldn't say this was something that was particularly a specialized tradition unique to a particular ethnic group. No. But your comment about the eating of soil, I think is very interesting. And I would love to hear more about that. Obviously, it's not the time here, but I think it's interesting that if it was something that people did voluntarily and not out of nutritional deficiency, barring the violence that was inflicted upon them, they wouldn't keep doing it. I would not connect eating soil as something so special that you would risk being put in an iron mask for it. I think this was far more connected to deficiencies in their health.
Thank you. I think those points you make are very reasoned and clear. Yeah.
Oliver Anza, would you like to ask a question?
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, I do. Hi, Oliver.
Okay. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I come from the context of the Southern Caribbean, particularly Venezuela and the Dutch ABC Islands. And in that region, turtles are very often seen to be used, also alongside the top shell is the queen conch, which you mentioned as well. And I was wondering, alongside those, how you see the remains of fish, how also those remains of fish could perhaps inform us about which methods are being used to capture fish and perhaps encounter some of these other marine resources that you've mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Your question is better suited to my colleague, Diane Wallman, who was able to find a lot of fish vertebrae and remains, as well as interesting weights that they were using in order to go fishing. I found nothing of that. I found very little fish, just enough to be able to identify certain varieties. And really, I didn't do that. I couldn't deal with the fish. I had my colleagues do it for me as a favor, and I bought them beer. Anyway, there wasn't enough fish or remains of fish for me to say anything beyond that. They did have some. It was so minute. In the samples that and again, maybe I should really state this, we did not excavate the entire slave village. These are just samples. Certain areas that we spent a lot of time concentrating on. So we didn't find a lot, which is quite different than what my colleague found in Martinique on that sugar plantation. So she was able to see a common strategy, a communal strategy of those that would go out fishing to do that. And there are historical records that on some plantations, there was a privileged enslaved person with the skill to fish that would be allowed to go and do that, like one person. Diane's research suggests that this was a common activity that many people partook in whatever way they could. I can't say anything about that. In terms of turtles, at least in Guadeloupe, the consumption of turtle meat, that was wiped out by 1700. And that was consumed mostly by the white colonists. That was never something that the enslaved community was allowed to do. So yeah, turtle was very popular, turtle eggs, turtle meat, stews, but all predominantly gone by the early 1700s.
Thank you.
The same question from two people. Is there any evidence of use of medicinal plants among foodstuffs consumed, for example, aloes?
My short answer, of course. absolutely, of course. But I didn't do any botanical studies. I was only looking at the ceramics and glassware and the faunal remains. But of course they were using herbs and different kinds of plants, not just to season and flavor their foods, but for medicinal purposes as well. I grew up that way. My family is from the Caribbean. So instead of, getting aspirin, my mom would go and take castor oil and slap an almond leaf on my forehead with a bandana and tell me to go lie down. Of course they did.
Thank you. Miles Greenwood, would you like to ask a question? Oh, okay. Let me ask, is there archaeological evidence that speaks to the differences and similarities in the diets of enslaved people and Maroons?
Wow, that is a great question. That would be a question that could be best answered on an island like Jamaica, where there were significant Maroon communities living over decades, or occupying areas over decades. Guadeloupe did not have, so Guadeloupe's two biggest islands, one is it's flattish with rolling hills. Nobody's hiding out there. You can see everything. Basse-Terre, so that was Grande Terre. Basse-Terre is mountainous, does have a volcano, does have a rainforest, and that is where many of enslaved fugitives did head off. I don't think there has been any Maroon sites located that we could try to do any excavations on. We definitely know of that in Jamaica, but not in Guadeloupe. I'm sorry.
Holly Binoy, would you like to ask your questions? It is quite detailed. Maybe it would be better if you ask it yourself. No, she's not probably here. Okay. What about rituals around the making of foods like farin, bemi, bem bem, and madonga? Sorry if I pronounce something wrongly, which brings up links to the indigenous. Are there any interconnections of practices or preparations of food between the indigenous populations of the French Caribbeans, Taino, for example, and enslaved Africans?
So the indigenous population of Guadeloupe were pretty much gone by 1600s, right? Intense cultivation of sugar cane began really in true force around 1670. Historical archaeology looking at enslaved Africans, there's so few sites that have been excavated. Very, very few. There have only been 3, to my knowledge. The majority of archaeology that's done in Guadeloupe, for the most part, is still either pre-colonial or just looking at the industrial period of sugar. So anything associated with slavery is still not really, no one's really doing that just yet. Only a few of us have begun that. So it's too early to say if we can find any sites associated from the 17th century where there might have been some contact with surviving indigenous populations and a young but small enslaved population. Fingers crossed that there is still some evidence that we can excavate and be able to analyze. But right now, that question can't be answered, unfortunately.
Another question is, have you tried to make any comparisons to African culinary practices?
Yeah. Oh, yes, I have, because I've been lucky to have excavated in West Africa as well as the Caribbean. And so the uses of particular foodstuffs like green leafy vegetables, okra, and the way okra is used with a little bit of meat, salted meat here or there, is very common. I think it's interesting that there's this name for fried dough, akra, that is reminiscent of what happened in, or what goes on in foodways, street foodways in West Africa. There are quite a few. The one pot stews and heavily using a lot of green leafy vegetables with your tubers is quite common. The use of heavily seasoning with chilies, you see on both sides of the ocean, but more specific practices, more specific, I can't tell you that just yet.
Okay. Another question is that Dr. Brunache, could you please explain the importance of archaeological approach of the topic?
The importance of this topic is centered on the fact that without archaeology, we would just have I would say, misinformed memory or understanding of slave foodways, and that there was no conscious choices being made to supplement what few rations that they received. The fact that whenever you come across, French witness accounts, it's, oh, these poor people, oh, they had nothing or very little given to them by the planter class. However, the archaeological evidence demonstrates that they never, ever just allowed themselves to starve to death, that they would take the chance, even if it meant knowing they would be punished for leaving the plantation, to go and find ways to supplement their needs in ways that we never really think of. So even the idea of what the white lens is, the white French lens is, their food is meager, their food is minimal. Very few records saying anything about them being able to go to the coastline and diversifying their dishes. None of that ever comes into play. The fact that you had enslaved Africans taking what few herbs and tubers and mixing it with a variety of different shellfish. You could have 5 ingredients and change one every day, and it's a completely different meal every single time, which is why I prefer to consider this slave cuisine and not just slave food. The fact that you could change the texture by how much you add okra, what you do to the okra to change its texture, what you do to add hot peppers versus aubergines or eggplants, how that changes the depth of flavor is ingenuity, it's creativity. But that was never seen from the top down. And archaeology offers an avenue to either complement or contest the historical record or the historiography of slavery.
Another question, and after this question, the hand reward. Okay, just a question. Do you have evidence for different aged domestic animals, different parts of the skeleton, different cooking methods, for example, roast, boiled, between the slave diet and the owner's diet, as has been shown in the plantation diets elsewhere?
we were not able to excavate or recover anything from the planters' refuse because that got blitzed out. That whole area of where the planter's home was and where he would have discarded, he and his family would have discarded their food remains, all gone. So absolutely could not say anything about their foodways besides what we read in the historiography.
Henry Ward, please.
Hi there, fascinating presentation. I'm actually a chef as well as a food historian, so I'm really interested in your talking about the foods as they're eaten today and what you don't like and what you do like. The whelk, I don't know that much about French Caribbean cuisine, and I've actually had whelk in like Chinese food preparations, so I know what they taste like. But is it part of the tradition today, the cuisine?
Okay, so, all right, so that was like one of these little side things that I've been very interested in. When I was able to find cookbooks from the late 19th century, I saw them. I saw recipes associated with cooking them. And then the few recipes that cookbooks that I could find in the 20th century, didn't see anything. But I did see something online only a couple of years ago where it's that reinterpretation of peasant cuisine or the old style, where they're starting to incorporate some of these old dishes in a new way. So apparently there are some high-end restaurants that are starting to reincorporate some of these old traditions, like cooking with whelks.
Like Renaissance sort of cooking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Do you have any other questions? Please just unmute yourself and ask.
I had a question.
Yeah,
but first, thank you so much, Dr. Brunache, for a really, really just incredibly rich and interesting and also deeply moving talk. One of the things that I found really interesting was your this kind of conceptualization, this really multi-layered conceptualization of labor, where you have this group of people who are forced to labor, and then also as a form of resistance, they're kind of taking on additional forms of labor. And part of that is to look for the kind of nutrition that they're missing in their diet, but also part of that is, as you say, in identity formation. It's in resistance, it's in rebellion, it's in kind of doing something deeper. And I was wondering how that also extended to kinds of food preparation. So the dishes that you maybe know that they cooked, are those labor intensive as well? Or how, because it kind of seems like a really, really complex thing. So I'm just curious about how that works across sourcing ingredients, but also preparation then.
So thank you so much, Danica. So that's an interesting question, because I find that's a question that could only be asked in the 21st century, in a time when we're so used to food coming out of the microwave. You go to the store, it's half made. The idea of labor intensive is not something I would try to impose on the past. It's just what you did. It takes a long time for food to be made. That's just how it was. No one thought that this was labor intensive. It is what it is. But that being said, knowing that a lot of these dishes were made in stews that would take a long time to cook, you would add these ingredients, but then you were out working in the fields and it was cooking. And when you were ready to come back, it's done. We're trying to kind of come back to that, the slow cooking, the hot pots that people are, pressure cookers, things like that. We're slowly starting to kind of come back around to that. But the idea of labor intensive is not something I would put a value on. It happened, But again, so much of it would be communal. You're not even thinking that it's work. You would see women or men working together to process certain foods for certain meals, but you're having a conversation, you're gossiping about whatever's going on. And you know, that kind of conversation makes the work fly by. So the idea of adding work is not something I would place upon the past, because everything was work. Everything was work. And you didn't think twice. It was hard, but that's just how it is. It's better than cutting cane. I would think no one would have a problem with that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's really helpful. Sorry, I think because I would say in India, most of our food preparation is still extremely labor intensive. So like rolling out chapatis and rotis by hand, for example, fresh for like every meal. So yeah, I think that there's a very interesting cross-cultural, across time, changing of this. Yeah.
You know, I think that's a very important question that you bring up, because it's our mindset about these things. There are dishes, my husband and I, we cook a lot, and a lot of the things we make takes a long time, but we enjoy that. We have friends who are like, if it takes more than 5 minutes, if I have to do more than stick it in the microwave, I'm not dealing with it. That's just how they are. But labor intensive is also enjoyable for certain people. And anything that deals with food, I enjoy, especially when I know that I'm going to make it for someone and they're going to enjoy it. Then it was worth all the work. And for me, it's not, the value of labor intensity isn't the same when it comes to food. And I would imagine it's quite like that for many people. Not everyone, obviously, but many people.
Any other questions, comments?
I have a question.
Yes,
first, Peggy, also thank you for the absolutely lovely talk. It made me so hungry. I'm just dying to go cook this minute, something intensive and long. My question is back about the fishing. And I was thinking of the Brazilian case. I also come from Brazil, where, you know, we have the best, our national cuisine comes from the slave tradition. And but it also varies per region. And fish obviously was not in the big plantations, but was incorporated in the coast. And I was thinking, do you think that the differences that you observe in Martinique and Guadeloupe, they are related to different, what I'm trying to say, were the plantation owners offsetting their costs of feeding the slaves by allowing them to go and fish or collect shellfish? And if that is the case, was it different strategies in the two islands that allowed the ones in Martinique to actually have access to fishing nets and fishing weights and go out and fish, and not in Guadeloupe?
So this is the problem that archaeology always comes up against, is the idea of individual choice. These idiosyncratic means of, well, we have two of the same type of plantations, both along the coast, both with large enslaved laborers, but yet this one allows them to have fish and go fishing, and this one does not. It's really hard to say. We always have to keep in mind that it's not always about this, did the slaver allow or not allow?
I know, but I was thinking if they, you know, in order to go fishing, you need materials and you need time. And we know that in many of these communities, they were not given that time.
So part of the thing with Guadeloupe and where La Mordière is, there's no place close that you could go fishing.
Okay.
That, you know, there's no beach.
The rocky.
Yeah, it's too rocky. It's too rocky. If you were going to find a locale where you could get onto a boat, it's too far away. So that may be one reason that you don't see fish. Another reason could be maybe of the samples that we collected and analyzed, those individuals didn't like fish. There are individual choices that we also have to keep in mind as well.
Lovely. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it, all of it.
Thank you, Marta.
Any other questions, comments, please? If not, thank you very much, Dr. Brunache, for absolutely fantastic talk. I think that we can, everybody just, thank you very much. And thank you for joining us once again. And we're waiting for everybody next Thursday. Please join us. And thank you very much.
I'm going to